Yes?
Mm.
Denver was a hub, as it happened, for beat folks from all over the country as they traveled. Many traveled to and from the Plain States and the Southwest and Mexico, members and friends of the Native American Church. From them came my first peyote tales. These were spiritual people, and peyote was never considered as a source of entertainment. I learned of it as a medium to the seeker of enlightenment. One night Don took some home, and we lay in bed all night, him completely overwhelmed with inner vision, me pretending to be. Somewhere in the early hours of pre-dawn, I did finally have a vision. What I saw was the Danish column-like structure of human beings all entangled with each other. Only my column was in motion. I really did see the panoply of history and emotion within those intertangled bodies, and that was my first psychedelic experience. 1964 was the twilight of the folk movement, and the Denver Folklore Center being right next door, I became acquainted with names like Blind Lemon Jefferson and Leadbelly for the first time, and aware that there was such a place as the Delta, from whence came the blues. In my culturally limited life, I had never heard blues nor known of their existence, really. I also had never heard the words jug band or bluegrass. I had no idea when I came to the Green Spider that there was a place called Appalachia, from which a rich, variegated, foot-stomping, heart-wrenching music emanated, but we had a house band called the Carpet Alley Jug Band. It was made up of young boys from the East Coast, and they were good. We had mandolin, guitar, banjo, and washed-up bass to listen to and absorb into ourselves on a regular basis. Mike Ferris, Kim King, and John Fishback, and a kick-ass mandolin player named Mac rocked our house every weekend till the early hours of morning and came in for impromptu get-togethers with other musicians passing through. My body, mind, and soul were reverberating with Footsteps in the Snow, Stealin', Black Mountain Breakdown, Rollin' in My Sweet Baby's Arms, all for the first time ever in my life. The sun might be going down on the folk movement, but on my love of bluegrass it would never set. Harry Tuft owned and ran the Denver Folklore Center. It was he who had brought Bob Dylan to town in February, and he who ran the Green Spider stage shows. The Folklore Center was the place where musicians passing through town could sit for hours on a wooden bench and trade stories and riffs, and have their instruments repaired by loving hands. Harry came from New York and brought with him the world that had come to life for me on the back of my Peter, Paul, and Mary album, in that vivid wording of the great master of language. In those early days, I was still so shy it was painful. It actually hurt. I was the quiet little mouse behind the scenes making coffee and sandwiches, an everyday fixture, yet never really a part of the hubbub of the swirling scene around me, just taking it in, and I drank it all in like honey. Sherry was there behind the counter with me, sometimes helping out, always my confidant. She and Don were my grassroots, my parents in this new world. Marta and her husband Maynard popped in occasionally on their way home, I guess from La Tarot, the other main coffee house. La Tarot catered to the other part of the beat crowd, those who like to sip and smoke to classical music, sort of early goths. They were a more sexually ambiguous, heady crowd. Marta would become one of my dearest friends, but not before I hit Manhattan and the West Village, and that was still light years away. Yet even now I found these two extremely intriguing, They were beautiful, ethereal people, utterly urbane and complicated. In many ways, the world of La Tarot was more my own, and yet the world of bluegrass and Martin guitars would shape me now. Within both worlds I would travel on. Time came somewhere in late autumn when Don was ready to cut the cord and move on, both from me and from the spider. Both would take months to separate himself from, and for me it would produce great trauma. It came as a shock when Don began talking of my needing to find my own way in the world. What? I had fallen into the daily rhythm of our lives, but it was such a short-term stability. Now he wanted me to find a job somewhere and move out on my own. Find a job? When my mother had pushed me out the door in September after graduation, I had wandered the downtown streets all day, too timid to actually go up to anyone and even ask if they might be hiring. I just couldn't get up the nerve. I was afraid of people beyond what most folks can understand, afraid of being rejected. After all, I was worthless, hopeless, and useless. I was quite sure one could see all that at first glance. I'd been told so in no uncertain terms all my life. Now I was supposed to go out there again. I'd gotten my job at Denver Dry because later in that horrible day after graduation, I'd remembered suddenly that a friend from Luther League at church was the daughter of the head of personnel there, and I'd had overnights at her home. I knew her mother. I could walk up to the counter and ask to speak to her personally. That had worked then. But now, well, that was the first place I went, taking Sherry along for moral support. Together we trudged downtown and took the elevator up to the 6th floor. My heart was in my stomach. My leaving when I did hadn't been well received at all. I'd been the favorite of the store's president. He'd taken it as a personal affront when I left, and now I was going back to beg for my old job. But I wasn't the same girl I'd been back then, and Sherry was the quintessential beat chick. No hiding the fact that both of us represented a lifestyle utterly shunned by the general population. The floodgates hadn't yet opened, and beatniks were not even remotely accepted within normal, decent society. So needless to say, even with a personal appeal on my behalf, I was not to be brought back into the fold there. I would have to keep looking. Don had become by now a preacher of sorts, spurring me on with parental-type lectures about my needing to break free of our bond, which was holding me back from the life that as a young person I was supposed to find out there. Much of the time I just wandered aimlessly now, very scared, lost, and alone. Finally, I was hired as a Christmas temp in the toy department of the May D&F department store. I lasted about 1 week. Can you imagine someone in my bewildered, jilted frame of mind with my fear of approaching people trying to sell toys to strangers? Toys? I didn't know the first thing about what children might like. There hadn't been one anywhere in my life since I'd been one myself. Then came the waitress fiasco. Oh, sure, I was hired, even trained for half a day. But a shy waitress who has the presence of a deer caught in headlights won't make it past the first shift. And of course, I didn't. So Don started putting out the money to keep me in this or that little room here and there. I guess he felt he had to see me through. And I was still behind his counter making the cappuccinos after all. He'd never paid me for that. It was just part of our little setup. Now I stayed on, and he helped me through the transition as best he could. I was so emotionally dependent on him that some nights I slept on his porch, all curled up in a very cold ball. Had he known I was there, he would have brought me in. He wasn't deliberately mean, but he had begun seeing other girls, more women now, and I could hardly knock on the door and ask him to join them, Don's little leftover waif. I was in dire need. Somebody, please, come pick me up. Somebody! While screaming inside, I was, as ever, nearly mute externally. How was somebody to hear me if I couldn't even speak? One night in the Spider, not working that night but out in the crowd, a young man saw me. He'd seen me before, but paid no attention. He'd been up on our little stage in the back room several times playing his big 12-string guitar. His favorite song was Hey Joe. He was bluesy and played all by himself without backup. He'd seemed fascinating to me right from the jump because of his long, thick black ringlets and his full black beard. A tall, slightly stoop-shouldered cat, he was different, mysterious. His name was Pete, and he was passing through. Or not. He and a couple friends had skipped out of college on the East Coast and decided to head for the West Coast. In need of something to pick themselves up for the last leg, they decided to, of all things, rip off a pharmacy. Right. Totally unseasoned at such enterprises, they were caught red-handed. They were all granted bail, and the others promptly left. But Pete's parents had come out from Jersey, gotten him cleaned up, and gone home, leaving Pete with a lawyer and a strong admonishment to stay put in Denver and see the court case through. He was 20. I was 21. When he saw me and I saw him, back on that night in the front room of the Spider, he was unrecognizable. All his mysterious locks were shorn, as was the beard, and he'd gotten himself tied up with a girl I didn't know who was a bit on the cuckoo side. And he was looking. They were living in a big, very old, roomy house a few blocks away, with the Carpet Alley Jug Band and all the girlfriends. Somehow, there happened to be a little Matchbox car up on the counter, and he started zooming it around in my direction. Next thing I knew, the two of us were zooming it back and forth and making plenty of furtive eye contact in the process. And so it began. Within only a few days, I was moving in and Cuckoo was moving out. A rather traumatic scene. But just like that, I was Pete's new girlfriend, and I became part of that musical stoner household. At long last set down amongst people my own age. And a musical household it was. Every night till the very wee hours, those boys would sit in the big living room with us girls next to them and jam and smoke and toke. In that comfy old living room, I smoked my first cigarettes and toked my first joints. Of course, I had to learn how. But with that accomplished, I was part of the family. A very quiet part, but a part nonetheless. I want to add a little aside here. The simplest thing, yet so crucial to me. Just an instant in time. All the time I'd been with Don, except for Sherry, I was really an anonymous fixture at the Spider. Don never had a personal relationship going with the musicians who came and went, or with Harry, so there wasn't any mingling for me. It was really him and me, him and me. He'd even said that once, and I was so shy, isolated. One afternoon after Pete and I had met, I came out of the little burger place a few blocks from the Spider. I'd gone in and had a grilled cheese by myself, and was walking along in the snow when one of the Carpet Alley girls said, "Karen, Pete's looking for you at the Folklore Center." This was before I'd moved into the house. Only if you know what it is to be isolated within a shell, can you grasp what it was for me to hear one of the in crowd yell out to me that I was wanted by another one of them. I had crossed the barrier of anonymity. I was part of them now. Everything had changed. The way those little words made me feel from head to toe enlivened and brightened my entire outlook on life. They meant something I can never adequately put into words, but in a real measure, I had jumped the broom again. Now I was able to enter the sea. Good night.